Hello and welcome to AEF TV in association with Engerati. I'm joined now by Dean White from Tetra Tech, who, and Dean informed me off air about this, is actually an Engerati member. So, it's a double bonus for me at the end of the first day of AEF.
And me as well.
Dean, welcome.
Thanks.
We're talking a little bit off air, and you're based in Dubai. You've done an enormous amount of work in Africa, and can you tell me a little bit about how the energy landscape in Africa has changed, and in particular some of the impacts that the Power Africa initiative may have had onto that as well?
Okay. I think the difference between what we see now and say what we've seen 5 years ago, it's a sea change in terms of the amount of interest that's in Africa, and you see it almost across the board. I mean, a large number of the countries of Africa are getting far more attention than they ever did in the past from the investors in the investment community and the donor community. I think the Power Africa initiative has been a catalyst in terms of bringing together the various U.S. government agencies as well as working with other governments. I mean, not just the African governments themselves, but also other donors, and putting together a concerted package, a toolkit, if you want to call it that, of ways in which to try to promote investment in the African power sector. I think one other change that I find particularly interesting is the fact that, say 5 years ago or even 10 years ago, so much focus was on generation, adding new plant, and I think that's still the case. Obviously there's a lot of attention there, but I do think also we're seeing much more richness. We're seeing distribution being addressed, we're seeing transmission being addressed, and fundamentally that's really where this effort needs to go.
And those things do need to be addressed, because we said it often enough on when we're covering things on Engerati as well, is when you bring renewables into the mix,
Right.
it changes the dynamic of the grid. We all know why it does that.
Right.
So the strengthening of that grid infrastructure needs to be there. If you're going to, because one of the narratives I was pulling out of last year is, Africa can leapfrog the energy mix, do it differently. Well, you ain't going to do it differently if you haven't got the T&D infrastructure.
Well, that's right. I agree with you entirely, and I think that especially the D, the D in the end is in my view, it's a critical link. We look at, say, in Nigeria, where Nigeria, of course, has problems at various levels, but even now, let's say in the past week or so, maybe 2,000 megawatts are making it onto the grid. Half of that electricity is lost along the way. Technical losses, theft, non-payment, and so forth. So if we don't get that right, then whatever we do further upstream is really compromised. So, but actually the T&D, it's also an interesting question, because I see efforts again, like say in Nigeria, to try to buttress the transmission sector, and that's all well and good. But at the same time, I wonder if in some cases the kind of model we're not going to see evolve in certain parts of Africa if it doesn't look like what we saw in the U.S. Way back when around industries, utilities developed sort of in specific areas, and eventually they were connected via a grid, to form a unified grid. And I do wonder in some of these countries if some sort of localized solutions like that, working off the grid, and then over time, integrating into the grid might be a way to go.
Microgrids, as
Absolutely.
the term is now, which aren't so micro. They're quite
Exactly.
big things, right?
Exactly. But I think in some ways, the solution has to be at both levels. We need to work, of course, on strengthening and expanding the current grid capabilities, but then at the same time, not put all of our eggs in that one basket, and also work in the off-the-grid space, in my view.
You mentioned Nigeria earlier. Is that one of the things that we can actually kind of learn from Nigeria as well? That this or almost fixation on generation to the detriment of everything else is.
I think looking back, I do believe there's been some of that in Nigeria, and I would say that just in the sense of we have in Nigeria probably at least 1,100 megawatts of new gas turbine. Much of that gas turbine capacity is not really delivering to market as much as it could, because we don't have the fuel getting to the plants. Or even if we do have the fuel, we may not have the transmission capacity to get it onto the grid. We may not be able to evacuate the power. So I think it is an example of the importance of looking at this as more of the total distribution, transmission, generation, and fuel supply. It's all got to be addressed, more or less in tandem in order to actually see the advantages of the reforms.
So how do you think that could be brought to bear? Because when
Yes.
you look at some of the things around the independent power provider initiatives in Kenya and South Africa, whatever, there is a fairly stable blueprint of a business model about how you
Absolutely.
make that happen. How do you make that happen from a transmission and distribution point of view? You could maybe do it from a transmission point of view, but on distribution, I mean, what are the models for investment?
Yeah, distribution is a messy business, but I think it's also a business. I mean, I find it fascinating because of the fact that investment in distribution is warranted once you have the proper management and control systems in place to make that investment. I could show, for instance, examples of companies where they went into a distribution utility that was suffering from excessive losses. They assume that, we'll put in smart metering, we'll put in some other technologies, and we'll solve the problem through technologies, and in fact the problem worsened because of the fact that they didn't have the proper management controls in place. I've been fortunate enough, I was served as a CEO of a state-owned utility, and when we took it over, we had 89% losses. So we were losing almost 90% of the electricity that was being put in.
Those losses were from what, theft or structural?
Theft, corruption,
right.
It was the full gamut. And also a lot of the equipment was old, but generally it was theft and non-payment, and it was a mess. 3 years later, we got the losses down to about 10%. At that stage, we could privatize the company successfully, and it turned out to be one of the biggest privatizations in the history of that country, and it's still operating to this day. But I think what was important about that was, what I saw by that exercise was, here was a company where when we took it over, it was maybe 0 to 6 hours a day of power, and it was somewhat randomized. By the time we restored 24-hour power, we were using the exact same amount of electricity. It's just it was all under control. Consumers were using it much more efficiently. They were turning things off when not in use because there was commercial discipline in the sector. So ultimately, that then allowed for the transmission company to be paid in full for their services. They could invest. That allowed generation to be paid in full. So that money that was coming,
that solved it all the way up the stack or down, whichever way you're looking.
It did, and actually what fascinated me is we had no investment. We were simply operating from the company's cash flows with a little bit of contribution occasionally from, we received some support from the U.S. government, some from KfW and
so
others.
How did you fix that?
But it was management, and it was interesting because, at least in my view, I think we diagnosed the problem correctly. It wasn't an engineering issue. We didn't need energy specialists to solve it. What we actually needed was proper managers. So we recruited from telecoms and from banking in particular, because those two sectors in that country were much further advanced, and they actually had good management talent. So the first two layers of our company, we didn't have a single energy specialist in those ranks. It was all strong managers who'd been brought in, and then we focused very heavily on the internal control systems and getting control over where the power was flowing, who was using it, putting in the systems, and essentially cleaning up.
Would smart meters
have helped you? They would have helped us at some stage.
Right.
And it is interesting because it's a really good question, because we had received some financial support to be used on meters, and we held off until such time as we knew we had control in a certain district. But we were getting a lot of pressure from others to spend the money, put the meters in, and I just feared that if you have a corrupted or not well-functioning utility, I always like to say, give me a dumb meter and a smart employee and I can run a very good utility. And that's not taking anything away from smart metering. It's just smart metering needs to have a foundation to build on, and over time we got there.
Because then you can maximize the capability that would give you, but it's not solves the core problem.
Exactly. Well, and the perfect example I like to use was, I've seen a smart metering program targeted at a utility that did not have the proper controls, and the meters were tampered with by the installers and the employees of the utility. So we ended up having sophisticated meters that still weren't properly registering, and it became I've seen that in another utility example. And so I think technology is great. It's just, first and foremost, we focus on management, try to get the management right, and then bring in the technologies that make sense, where they make sense.
I always say that the stack is people, processes, and technology.
Absolutely.
A lot of people, particularly technologists, think you can pile in a load of technology and it solves everything. There's no point.
Absolutely not. No, I think even in our case, we ended up focusing our attention on one narrow district, so let's at least get this district under control, functioning right. Once that happened, we were able then to start limited investments, and we sort of built out. And then we proved the model, and then that model allowed us to go to the government and show that we actually had a solution. So
that brings me kind of back to the context we are in Africa, and one of the things that I find that I feel doesn't bubble up often enough. Yes, you need the right gas turbines, solar, wind, all that stuff.
Right.
But you also need to create a localized skill set to
absolutely
run everything and make it sustainable, so that things don't come in and you end up having an influx of foreign skills but no skills transfer.
I could not agree with you more on that point. I think it's absolutely critical. In fact, I think if we look at successes in terms of bringing in the private sector to distribution and failures, I would argue that one of the key drivers has been the actual leveraging of, bringing the local talent to bear. In our case, for instance, when we took over the utility, there were about 5 of us as foreigners who were implanted into the company. I had the benefit of having been in the country for a few years, so I kind of knew my way around. But very quickly, we actually transitioned over to a local management team with just me essentially providing the political cover and handling the relationships with the government and so forth. That team is still in place to this day, running the utility long after I've gone. And that's exactly the model. It's got to be local. The talent is there in every country. I've never found a country yet where we haven't been able to identify the talent that can be used to turn around the situation. It's absolutely vital. So.
And just as we're coming to the end of our time here, the Power Africa initiative.
Yes.
Has that had the accelerating effect that it was designed to have?
I believe it has, because I think that it has created so much momentum around the need to bring investment, to expand electricity access, to address the problems that are seen in the African energy system. I think it's, the goals are lofty. There's no doubt about it. 30,000 megawatts in 5 years, 60 million, new connections. Those are lofty goals, but we love the ambitious targets. But I do think when I see the 120 partners that are in the Power Africa program, companies that are doing off the grid, on the grid, financiers, other foreign governments, multilateral, bilateral institutions that are all coming together, it does create this major sort of impetus to help the situation here. And I do think we'll perhaps some may question what results are we seeing and so forth. Well, the power sector is a messy business, so we are dealing now with generation, distribution, transmission, regulation, policies, and so forth, on a country by country basis, and that takes, that's just hard work where you have to roll up your shirt sleeves. But the results, there is only one direction here. I mean, we cannot continue to have a country like Nigeria, 170 million people, with so much potential.
So many reserves at the doorstep.
Right, exactly. Being served with 2,000 megawatts on it in terms of generation availability, and those 170 million that do have access to the power, they're generally being charged through estimated billings. They don't have proper meter. I mean, the customers are really being not even properly served, those that do have electricity. So we have to address all of this in its totality. So.
Well, Dean, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Unfortunately,
Thanks.
that's all we've got time for. I hope you
Fair
can
enough.
Join us next year. Maybe we shouldn't wait next year. Maybe we should connect off air and see what else we can do.
Okay.
But thank you as well for watching. It's
Thanks.
been the end of day one of AEF. I hope you enjoyed our coverage, and we look forward to day two. Thank you.
Thanks. Great.